The Western world needs a reality check because, you take the Danish prime minister. She walks in on the 7th of October into the synagogue in Copenhagen in support of Israel. And before she walks in, she says to a journalist that Hamas would invade Denmark also if they could get away with it.
You know that sinking feeling you get when you realize you have been played? Well, get ready because Jan Oberg is here to reveal just how expertly the strings are being pulled, whether it's in the Middle East, Europe or beyond. And no, this isn't just about wars and propaganda. It's about a system in decline. A system that is desperate to hold on to power, doubling down on its worst instincts and dragging everyone else along for the ride. Take NATO for example. Oberg, as many other guests on this channel did too, tears about the narrative that it's all about defense. He shows us how NATO's expansion and militarization have fueled instability rather than preventing it. But that's only part of the story. In the Middle East, the picture is way darker. Western complicity in Israel's ongoing occupation of Palestine, the framing of Gaza's devastation as anything but genocide, and the relentless erasure of accountability under the guise of security. When we connect the West's policies in Gaza, Ukraine or elsewhere, and demonstrate how these conflicts are deeply interwoven, you will realize that they are just different stages of the same destructive game. And then there is Sweden, the supposed bastion of neutrality, now fully integrated in the grip of NATO. Was the shift inevitable? Or was it the result of decades of manipulation? Remember the Cold War era U-boat scare that had the Swedes convinced their waters were crawling with Soviet submarines? Turns out that fear was completely manufactured. It was part of a concerted effort to align Sweden with the West, with the full knowledge of the Swedish military. Talking about manufacturing consent. And let's not forget the still unsolved assassination of Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme. He was a leader who dared to stand up against the militarization of his country. Coincidence? Or pieces of a larger plan to dismantle Swedish neutrality in the service of a US-led NATO expansion? Now put this into the context of today. But our conversation today doesn't just cover the Middle East or NATO, it shows how these pieces fit together in a world gripped by declining empires, rising propaganda and missed opportunities for peace. So stick around because this is the kind of interview that might just change the way you see the world. One last thing. Critical voices like the ones you hear on this channel are being actively silenced and suppressed. You may not notice it, you may not know it, you may not even believe it, but it does happen and I have the statistics to prove it. So if you do value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, hit that subscribe button, like and share, it really makes a difference. And for those who want to keep up with my work, make sure you join me on Substack. No restricting algorithmic filters there. Or listen to my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Amazon. The links are in the description below. Thank you. Jan Oberg, a real pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining my little endeavor here.
Thank you.
How are you?
I feel good.
You feel good.
We're speaking in the morning after the American election, so I can't say that I'm happy with either of the candidates. I would have voted for Jill Stein, but I mean, long story short, I'm happy to get rid of the Biden administration.
Okay.
For what it has done and for what it would do if it had continued. It's been an awful period in foreign policy of the United States and the Western world with the Gaza genocide, etc.
This is a perfect gate segue into our discussion. The US election, it has not been confirmed yet, but it looks clearly that Trump is going to win. And then my first question right away to you would be, And we can split this out. Yeah, we can split this out actually in three parts. What will this mean for the conflict in Gaza? What will this mean for the conflict in Ukraine? And what will this mean for the potential conflict with China?
Well, I'm not a prophet. But I think that, I mean, we're in a situation in which let's now assume that Trump has won this election, which it looks like at the moment. We're in a situation in which we really don't know anything like a clear program. Robert F. Kennedy, for instance, had a clear program for peace when he was a candidate before he joined Trump. And, you know, we have Trump saying that even before I'm installed as a president, I will, you know, grab the phone with Putin or Zelensky and I'll stop that war. He said that so many times that he cannot not do something like that, even in November or December or, you know, before he's elected. I'm not quite sure where he stands when it comes to the Gaza genocide and I mean, it's more than that in the Middle East, as we both know. It's much bigger, it's much more complex. There is definitely a looming war with Iran, Israel, or with Israel and a number of other countries. And I don't see a plan. I mean, I have not investigated. I have not followed it. I'm not a geopolitical analyst. I'm not an expert on US policies. I work with other things at the moment. But your third question is, of course, that Trump is known for being very stern trade-wise and investment-wise with China. We will put up to, what did he say, 60% of import customs percentage on Chinese cars, etc. I mean, he's funnily enough, as a businessman, he seems to be very much in favor of protectionism. Whereas the Chinese are now the champions of free trade. It's the opposite world and what it used to be. And I think there's a little twist to this that I would like to give you. We published 3 years ago a report, and I say the Transnational Foundation, of which I'm the director and co-founder, which was called the Smokescreen Report, about the Western way of presenting a consistently negative image of China. I mean, there's a Cold War going on in words and media. There's no doubt about that. It's well financed, you know, something like $1,500 million the next 5 years for planting negative stories in the Western press about China. Since I work in China, I know all this is propaganda. But long story short, that in that report we started out with a video in which Joe Biden is in China and he speaks in a classroom to probably high school students. And in the back of the room sits Chinese President Xi Jinping and listens to him. And his whole speech, and that's about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when he was there as a vice president, the whole speech is about how important and wonderful it is for the US to have very close and good friendly relations with China. The whole thing is about how important it would be for American young students. He speaks to them directly in this Chinese classroom, how welcome they are to come and study in the American, and how wonderful it would be if American students could study in China and we could be friends. Now, what I wonder is what happened in between. Because obviously Joe Biden had the idea, when he was clear in his mind and all that China was a friend. And now, you know, NATO presents that China is the biggest, they don't use the word threat formally, I think they say challenge. And you know what the argument is? The argument is that they have different values and interests from us. That's enough. It's not that they are building bases all over the world. It's not that they are running genocides all over the world. It's not that they are warfare all over the world. It's not that they are arming. Well, they are arming, and that's what NATO says, but everybody knows it's at a much lower level than the Western world. But it is that they are different from us. And you see, that is the challenge. I don't know whether Trump, to get back to the elections, I don't know whether Trump is able to understand, wish to understand that the time of the Western world is over as a leader. You can become one of many. We're going into a multipolar, or I prefer with Chas Freeman to say multi-nodal. We're nodes because they are not poles like poles in the ground, like a temple or something like that. But we're moving into a world in which the US and its empire will no longer be anything special. And I don't know whether Trump will be the president who can manage in the same beautiful, graceful way as Gorbachev did manage the falling apart of the demise of the Soviet Union. I can have my doubts about whether Trump is willing to accept that the United States is going to be one among many and not the leader of the world anymore with its empire. I'm not talking about the states, because the states will exist in the future, I suppose, unless you have an implosion of the US in a civil war. But what I'm saying is the empire will go. All empires go up and all empires go down. And this is a time, there's no doubt, all the indicators are there, that the US empire is going down. Now, what you and I don't know is how Trump will react, how he will handle the decline of the US empire. Or will he be smart enough to say, okay, our time is over, let's get the best out of it. Biden was not able to. Trump is an unpredictable character. He may as a businessman, as a player, as a game person, he may be able to handle this better than you and I fear at the moment, or at least I fear. I shouldn't tell what you think. But what I fear is that he could go the other way because he sees that this decline is unstoppable. And it is unstoppable. There's no doubt about it. The US empire, the Western world, NATO, and all that dominating the world is not going to happen in the future. The question is, how do you go down gracefully when you have nuclear weapons, when the dimension in which you're the strongest is the military? It's very tempting, you know, because we don't have a Gorbachev in the Western world. We don't have a decent man with a vision and moral standards and an idea about how we could live together, which he had. We don't have such a leader in the Western world. So we're in the situation that for the first time, the US empire will go down, and we don't know how those who sit at the top, and it will happen within the next 4 years, how people on the top of that will react and handle that decline of the empire, that demise of the empire, and how they will play the game to enter the new world as a cooperative power, because that's the only future for the West. It is to join the rest of the world. That's I think is a civilizational challenge we're heading for, and therefore the whole thing is much more. Let's say it's much more complex, much broader than the question of who is in the White House from January. It is a matter of where will the Western world, including the European Union, including NATO, how will we operate in a world in which we are no longer dominating?
I think, so first of all, I agree with you. I strongly believe that the American empire comes to its end. You simply have to look at the figures, the financial figures. They're paying now more interest rates for their debt than their already exorbitant expenditure for defense. Yeah, how long can you keep this? How long can you keep this up? Yeah,
no, you can't.
In addition, you have the BRICS coming up, the de-dollarization, but people don't realize the petrodollar is the lifeblood of the American empire. No petrodollar, no empire, no 11 carrier groups. Yeah, this will all crumble.
Very true.
I compare the American empire with the proverbial elephant in the porcelain shop, but this elephant is wounded, and it's the question. Coming back to you, that's exactly the question. How much damage? Because I do not believe on a benevolent, wise leaders plural in the US, but also in Europe. I live in the Netherlands. As you know, the former PM is now NATO Secretary General. They're driving Europe into a hot war with their sleepwalking. They're virtually sleepwalking Europe into a hot war with Russia. I mean, you have to let this sink in.
And that is where we could hope that Trump will be more unconventional in terms of diplomatic initiatives. You know, I can fix that problem. I'll grab the phone and talk to
I
my
just heard it.
friend
I just heard him
Vladimir.
say it. I just heard him say it in this kind of, acceptance speech that he held a half an hour ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is potentially a very good thing. You know, somebody who begins to do things differently from Blinken and Austin and Biden, where we have not had diplomacy for years in the Western world. We have had, no matter what the problem is in the world, we send more weapons. We send our naval vessels. We threaten this and that. And that, of course, is a sign of the decline also that you and I agree on. You blame everybody else for what is your own problem, because there is no one in the world who threatens the West.
Yeah, you mentioned.
You may say threaten economically. There's nobody who threatens or want to have a war with the West. The Russians don't want it. Their problem is Ukraine and nothing more. It's not even all of Ukraine. It's parts of Ukraine. The whole hullabaloo about he's going to take Ukraine and then he'll go to the Baltic republics and then he will do this and that. It's complete bullshit. I'm sorry to say so as an intellectual who's worked with this for 50 years. It has nothing to do with, and I think it's time that we make those people accountable who say that. What has happened before Mr. Putin lands on the southern coast of Sweden, where I sit and speak to you, because that is what the Swedish military has been saying for years now, serving only NATO membership, of course. It's nothing. It's blackmailing of the people and playing on fear, what we sociologists call fearology. But there is nobody who threatens the West, and therefore we ought to calm down and join the world instead of dominating the world. That would be a more peaceful strategy. Perhaps Trump is able to do that.
We will discuss Sweden and its NATO membership. We will discuss it. Yeah? But you just said you said two things: Just Freeman and diplomacy. So I interviewed Just Freeman actually 2 or 3 times now, and he said exactly that. Diplomacy is dead, and he meant it actually literally. There is no more talk between America and Russian leadership. It's dead. There's nothing left.
Much worse than the first Cold War. Much worse, because there's no contact. Much worse. Everybody knew, and people who had, you go back to your country, Willy Brandt, Bruno Kreisky, Olof Palme, Anke Jørgensen, Genscher. They all knew that no matter whether we were antagonists, we have to communicate. We have to avoid a mistake. We have to prevent that a military exercise ends up in a real war and things like that. They were wise people. They were people who knew what war was. That was that generation. The fools who are sitting there, like the Prime Minister of Denmark, I'm a Danish citizen, so I follow her very closely, are militarists with no braking mechanisms. They are willing to do whatever. You have leaders in Europe saying today, I don't care about Russia's red lines. Excuse me, how would you feel if somebody over there said, I don't care about NATO's red lines, or I don't care about what the other party says? We always cared historically, since 45 and onwards, we always cared about what the other party said. And that was what the Palme Commission came up with, which is one of the most simple and brilliant concepts: common security. We are not safe unless they are safe with us. That is a thinking, that's an intellectualism that does not exist in the Western world anymore. And that is very dangerous when you have nuclear weapons and long-range missiles.
And more sophisticated ones, yeah. Talking briefly about NATO, yeah. Do you know the Swiss historian, Dr. Daniele Ganser?
Not personally, but I know who he is, yes.
Okay. I interviewed him because he wrote the book about the shadow armies that were left behind.
Staying behind, yes.
Stay behind armies, yeah. Quite interesting stories, because these stay behind armies seem to have been highly involved into terrorist acts in various European countries. That pointing direction Olof Palme. But we come to Sweden. Briefly back to Trump. Yeah. So I agree with you. There might be some unconventional approach when we talk about Russia and Ukraine. On the other side, when we talk about the Palestinian issue, I'm not so confident. Seeing what he already implemented, seeing that he got, I think Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, dropped $100 million, and so he's very much in the grip of the Israel, or better Zionist lobby. Yeah. We know that.
Yeah.
So what's your inclination here, in which direction he might go?
No, I share that view. And I also think, when you have been a presidential candidate and you have no plans and you're not presented a plan for simply stopping this madness, which is deeply destructive, of course, for the Palestinians, my God, but also for the Western world, because the Western world is 11% of humanity and the 89% see it. And out of the 89% of the, I don't call it the rest, but the West and the rest is a playing on words, but the majority world of 89%, many of those have had the experience that Palestinians have had, being colonized historically in Africa and Asia and South America. So, that speaks to humanity and the brutality of the Zionist Israel, which is calling itself a Jewish state. Is of such proportions that it will, for generations ahead, be a black spot on the Western world. We did not prevent it. We supported it actively, from Mrs. von der Leyen to the presidential candidates, and to the whole of Europe. There's nobody who has done what international law tells you, because the Genocide Convention says it's our duty to prevent it, and if it has started, to stop it. Now, did you hear anybody talk about humanitarian intervention in this case? That was used in Yugoslavia. It was invented to be used in Yugoslavia in the 90s, right? Nowhere where you would have needed, I'm not an advocate, as you know, I'm an advocate of nonviolence, but if there is a place where humanitarian intervention would have been a very, very appropriate thing to do, simply to stop the carnage, simply to mass murder, that would have been the Palestinian case. Or you might say back in time, Rwanda and Burundi, and then Congo, of course. And I mean, nobody even mentioned the idea that we could intervene and stop it because it's Israel doing it. Imagine Russia had done that somewhere, China had done that somewhere. There would have been a huge effort via the UN or in other ways to stop it and to blame them for doing it. Now you have a Western mainstream press that basically supports the genocide by not covering, calling it a war and things like that. It's a genocide. And we wrote that about a few months after it happened, when we deliberated on when we put it all together. We used that word, a statement on the genocide in Gaza. And I'm proud that we did, because it is obviously what it is. It is so obvious that the idea is to get rid of people or make their lives impossible in that territory. And I don't see anybody, unfortunately, also not Robert F. Kennedy, because he is pro-Israel, has explained himself to be in such strange words for an otherwise intelligent intellectual, that I think that if he becomes a minister, a secretary in the Trump administration, probably for, I don't know, health or education or what, I don't think he'll be Secretary of State, then you can forget about the US doing anything there, because I don't know whether it's the tail wagging the dog or what it is, but I call the two countries US-rail, because it is so intertwined. And you poured in billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars in armory in the last, 30, 40 years in Israel. And I'm not anti-Israeli, but I'm anti-occupation. I'm anti-nuclear weapons. I'm anti-genocide. I'm not against self-defense, Article 51 of the United Nations, but this is not self-defense. This is Greater Israel. And when I, 20 years ago, did a lot of interviewing in Baghdad, right before the war, a lot of people there said, what we are up against is Greater Israel. And then I said to myself, that sounds a little bit overblown. Today, I don't think it was overblown, what these diplomats and former ambassadors told me in Baghdad in 2003, in the very early, I left Baghdad 2 weeks before the invasion. Now, long story short, if this is what we're heading for, then I asked myself, why did we talk about Greater Serbia, which never existed? Why did we use these arguments earlier that somebody should not make themselves bigger than they are, and then we let Israel do it. You know, this exceptionalism is very dangerous, but it has to do with a lot of factors which makes the United States and Israel very close to each other. They're colonial systems, they are apartheid systems.
They're based on genocide.
Based on genocide, you can say also, yes. Based on, well, that can be discussed. At least that's what you have now in the system.
No, I mean the US. They're based on
yes,
genocide.
yeah, sure. Yeah. They're based also on the idea of exceptionalism. We can do something that nobody else can do outside the law, so to speak. We are not playing according to common norms. And then you are the chosen people. So you can get away with these things because you are different from everybody else. And, you know, that type of system is so appalling and so self-destructive. And that's something I've argued for years now. The West tries to destroy others with warfare and destroy terrorism by killing terrorists and all these stupid things that should be done differently. The fact is that we are destroying ourselves. I've never been anti-American. Culturally and otherwise, I'm growing up with the American being incredible, innovative, culturally. You know, you have Bob Dylan, you have Robert Rauschenberg, you have all these things, right? Tom Lehrer, you can go on like that. I grew up with this. And what I see today is what was once a very interesting, innovative society being dependent or hit by a cancer called militarism. We are militarizing ourselves to death in the Western world. We cannot afford it. We will be hated by the rest of the world because we do it. And we will destroy our own economy, our fiber, our mentality, because as Gandhi always said, you may shoot somebody and you may hurt somebody else, but you hurt yourself when you do it. It is destructive for your mind. It's destructive for your ethics. It's destructive for your civilized, your being a civilized person, that you do things like that because you know you do it. It's not something we don't know. If you kill people, mass kill people like the Americans have done now for decades, of course you know it. It's self-destructive. So, you know, we're in a very, very sad situation. I'm not happy about it at all. Lots of people say, oh, down with the US and all that. I've never said that. I wish that the world would come and help the West. You see what I mean? And I think if anybody can do it, it's the Chinese, because they are not hateful. I traveled enough in China. You cannot make Chinese say something bad about the West. It's very interesting.
There's a massive
But they
propaganda.
want cooperation. And if they could open up if Trump administration in the future could open up and say, we want to cooperate with the world, he may save a lot of credit. He may save a lot of the United States.
It's a good question.
I'm not saying I think he will. I'm saying if he could be, it would be great.
It's a good question.
Don't get me wrong.
If Trump, on the other hand, he's a businessman.
Yes, he's a businessman.
So he might strike a deal with China.
Yeah,
but
he might turn around. You know, at the moment he seems to. I think the Chinese are very aware that he's a xenophobic candidate. But so was Biden. You know, I don't think the difference there is very big.
Okay. Now, before we continue this absolutely fascinating discussion, I would like to take a moment, just a little moment, to focus on you. So maybe you tell us a little bit more. I know you have a PhD. I know you're a sociologist. Tell us a little bit about you and your Transnational Foundation for Peace and Research.
Well, how many hours do we have?
I have time.
Jokes aside, no, I'm a sociologist. As you said, I'm a Danish citizen. I came to Sweden 52 years ago to study sociology. And there I got in the hands of peace research. The head of the Department of Peace Research and a teacher, also professor of sociology, was Håkan Wiberg, who is one of my mentors. The other mentor is Johan Galsson, who died in February this year. And I knew him for 50 years and we were very close friends. And I'm still very sad that he's gone. And then I had an influence in my high school, because my high school headmaster, whatever you call it, the leader of that school was one of those who had organized the transport. And that was very risky during the Second World War, or 7,000 Jews from the Danish coast north of Copenhagen to Sweden. And he was actually becoming a Danish a rector or chancellor of the Danish school in Lund, Sweden, where I sit. We were very close when I was in high school, and he was Denmark's leading pacifist. So, you know, when I was 15, 16, 17, I got this influence that maybe there are other ways of dealing with each other than doing violence, right? And that was during the Vietnam War and all these things going on. And the Cultural Revolution in China and the Cold War and the intervention in 68 in Prague. And, you know, I have lived very fortunately in a period of very interesting global historical changes, including the end of the First Cold War. And we all celebrated. I was down knocking with my wife on New Year's Eve on the wall, drinking champagne with Eastern and Western, etc. So what I think I'm probably one of the very few people who, with an academic background, insist that there are alternatives to militarism, there are alternatives to violent conflict resolution. If we could learn to handle our conflicts intelligently and educate each other, I believe that peace can be learned. But somehow with a military, industrial, media, academic complex, we cannot get to that point. We have a small elite that, you know, basically all countries, which I think it was Eisenhower. Well, it was Eisenhower, of course, in his farewell speech, who talked about the military-industrial complex, MIC. And I learned a lot about that when I was a student, and I thought it was right, and I've seen wars, etc. But also, I have expanded on that to call it MIMAC, and that's a military-industrial media academic complex. And that's a little bit broader, but I'm sure the media today is a very big factor in promoting war. The mainstream media, not people like you in media, that type of media, but, you know, New York Times or whatever has always been on the wrong side. And they do have an influence, have had an influence. Now that is changing and they're losing influence, thank God. So what we do in the foundation here, I left the university in '89 because the fools there closed down peace research and all other interdisciplinary studies at Lund University. And then I said, goodbye, if you don't want peace research, I don't need you. So I've been a freelance professor around the world, living in different countries. And my wife and I, Christina, who is also a doctor in sociology, we started this private foundation out of our house in '86 with about 50 people around the world who are all diplomats, psychologists, military people, former military people, peace researchers, etc. And we are a networking foundation. We have no employed people. None of us are paid for what we do since '86. And we, as a principle, do not accept money from the government or from corporations. So you may say, how do you support? How do you survive? We survive simply by people finance. As long as we do work that people like and think is important, we will survive. And the day we may not do that, we will close it down or we become too old. But the long story short,
and what exactly are you doing with this foundation? What exactly are you doing?
We are committed to, and thanks for asking that question, because we are committed to Article 1 of the UN Charter. Most people don't know it. The UN is to prevent warfare. But Article 1 says that peace shall be established by peaceful means. All countries who are members of the UN have signed that they will work for peace by peaceful means. That is the greatest goal of humanity, in my view. So we are working for the greatest goal of humanity. And so what we have perhaps been characterized by is that we've not only done academic studies, we've gone to war zones, we've interviewed people in conflict areas and tried to find out by listening to them and not to the media, what is this about? And so, for instance, I was a mediator in the Kosovo conflict for 4 years, running back and forth between the Kosovo Albanian leadership. And I'm not talking about UÇK and the militarists, but the nonviolent leader of Kosovo, Dr. Rugova, and 3 governments in Belgrade and at that time, President Milosevic. So what we have done is, as a completely independent group, is to do independent analysis of what is the conflict about. And then proposing ways to peace plans or whatever. We are the only foundation, only organization that made a 3-year negotiation plan for Kosovo a couple of months before NATO started bombing the hell out of the place. So there's no doubt in my mind, Kosovo could have been solved by talking to each other. I've argued for years, way before it all happened, that we should have the UN stationed in Ukraine, in the Donbas area, 300,000 people on the ground, like in the Krajina. There's a place in Croatia, which is called Krajina. Krajina was the Serb-dominated pockets of Croatia. 12% were Serbs of Croatia. Nobody cared about that. Nobody knew about Yugoslavia enough to do what we did there. But it means border. Ukraine means border, and Krajina means border. And that's where you have mix of people, and your majorities and minorities, and your minorities inside majorities, and you have majorities somewhere else that try to influence. No, this is something the UN can do and nobody else can do. But nobody, the United Nations has been marginalized completely. And for your viewers, let me say the world spends 300 to 400 times more on armament than on the whole budget of the UN. How do you expect them to quell fires with that proportion? We have a perverse world in which every money is available for militarism, for warfare, for new arms, but it's not available for the United Nations and other decent, intelligently formulated, and very important organization. I'm a staunch believer in the UN Charter, while also, of course, seeing that we need to do a lot of reforms of the UN. It belongs to a different world after the Second World War, but throwing it out now would be the worst we could do. So,
it's the worst.
Long story short, we have done academic work, theoretical work, common security work, and we have worked in places like all former Yugoslavia, Georgia,
you said Baghdad,
Burundi, fact-finding in Baghdad before the war, and I've been there since then, and Syria, Iran, and now the last 3 years we've been in and out of China. And that's what we do because we want to learn about China. And in contrast to so many other people who just have opinions about China, we go there and talk with people. And we've just been to Xinjiang, the place where the West says there's a genocide going on, has been a genocide. And so extending, cooperation with scholars around the world, no money involved, but simply linking up because there's something called citizens diplomacy, something called researchers diplomacy. And I'm a staunch believer that humanity can come together and live together, but our leaders have a difficulty with imagining that we can live together, particularly in the West, because we have this dominance, Christian dominance, missionary activity in the West, which is self-destructive. But we must continue to do what we believe in, and I believe in nonviolence.
I like the comparison I heard you talking about when it comes to Taiwan and China. You said to an American public, yeah. I mean, imagine if China suddenly armed Hawaii.
Oh yeah.
It's very fitting.
Well, I don't know whether it holds water, but I say it also to make people think. What is it we do thousands of kilometers away? Even Denmark now is setting off military personnel to participate in this. And I ask myself, and that's a very important capacity for somebody who works with security, that's empathy. How will the other side see what we do? And NATO has no empathy. Mr. Stoltenberg had, well, maybe he has as a person, I doubt it. I knew his father, but I never met him. But empathy is something that doesn't exist in these circles today, meaning simply not sympathy, but empathy. How will the others live yourself into the shoes of the others? How would you react if you saw somebody doing that to you? That's a normal human thing to do. Before I say something publicly or I say something to my wife, I think a little bit, how will she react if I say this and that way? You know what I mean? And it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be a human capacity with those who run security politics today. And that's also why the word peace is gone. It's gone from research, it's gone from media, and it's gone from politics. The word peace is out. It's a taboo word today because peace cannot be made without empathy. And so the distinction that is very important that I learned from Johan Galtung is never mix up the war and violence on the one side and the conflict. You cannot solve the conflict by addressing the violence. You can only make peace if you address the underlying conflict. So what is the underlying conflict in Ukraine? It is between Russia and NATO's existence and expansion, and the expansion that all Western leaders promised Gorbachev would not take place.
Not an
Now, if you
inch.
don't have a 30 years perspective on what happens in Ukraine today, you should shut up, because that is the problem. And that's what Russia reacts to, which I didn't and do not defend. The day after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, I wrote an article that did not have to happen. But I can understand it. So by understanding something, it doesn't mean that we defend it. But intellectually, that distinction is too difficult for most people in the West. So the moment you say, well, this has also got to do with NATO's policies the last 30 years and its way of expanding against others, people say, oh, you're a Putin lover. And then the discussion is stopped. We no longer have a factual, complex, intellectually decent ability to talk about these things in the media in the Western world. You're just positioned. If you say certain words, then you're a Putin lover, and the discussion is over. Now, I'm old enough to remember that was not the case in the Western world. Earlier, we could have such a decent discussion. I mean, I was in CNN, I was around the world talking about Yugoslavia, and people could see, yeah, well, it's complex and da-da-da-da-da. Now it's just, oh, if you say so, then we can't talk. And that's why it's 25 years since I was last on Swedish television. I don't know enough, obviously, to satisfy their needs.
That's the similarity between October the 7th and the Russian invasion into Ukraine. Both of which in our media seem to have been fallen out of thin air. So
It was unprovoked.
Unprovoked, yeah.
Oh, completely unprovoked, yes. By a NATO alliance that at that time was 12 times bigger than Russia in terms of military expenditures. And we didn't see that. I mean, the present Cold War is a very strange thing, because the old Warsaw Pact was much stronger compared with NATO than Russia has been the last 30 years compared with NATO's military strength, if we measure that by military expenditure. Russia is not a threat. And I've written a long article, 15 arguments why Russia is not a threat to any NATO country, and it has not either been a threat to any neutral state. You may say you are threatened if you live close to Russia historically, but so is Russia, because it's the West that has invaded Russia. It's not the other way around.
Twice. Through Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean,
Napoleon,
history doesn't
Hitler,
exist anymore either in the West.
Exactly.
You look into the complex history of Yugoslavia, nobody understood it. I would say there were maximum 5 people in the European foreign ministries who knew anything about Yugoslavia that was useful in the early 90s when it started. They thought everything was black and white.
It was the so-called war in Yugoslavia was to destabilize, to weaken, Russia. Right, there was the first hot war, when NATO actually flexed its muscle under the guise of humanitarian aid or help.
Yes. And I mean, if we're talking about words, it was unprovoked. Probably you don't hear that word so much more, but I'm asking myself a question: who masterminds these words? If you take Gaddafi in Libya at the time, he was always head of state Gaddafi. He was Muammar Gaddafi. He was Colonel Gaddafi. He was this and that. Within 2 weeks, all the Western media called him a dictator. In the case of Yugoslavia, Clinton gave a speech saying Europe now has a new Hitler. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. And then you have the unprovoked, which of course psychologically means we know we provoked it. But everybody says it. The media says it, the scholar says it, the politician says it. Suddenly everybody after the invasion said it was unprovoked. And now you have the new word, full-scale invasion. Everybody says full-scale. I went through some peace research institutes in Sweden on the net. And, again and again, even peace researchers who should be able to think a little bit, sorry, but I had that idea that they would be a little bit different from the militarists, are writing that this was unprovoked and it was a full-scale invasion. The only thing it was not was a full-scale invasion. It was a special military operation with far too few troops. That much I know about military affairs, although I'm not an expert in this field. But it was far too little troops to have taken all of Ukraine. It was not a full-scale invasion. It was a medium or small-scale invasion.
It was 180,000 troops that we had at the beginning. But to give a comparison, Hitler invaded Poland in the Second World War with 1.8 million, almost 2 million. Yeah, that's a full-scale invasion.
That was a really full-scale, maybe 300,000 or 400,000 into Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert.
180,000.
Where does the word come from?
Yeah.
And my sense is, you will have an American embassy in all countries, and they will probably send a letter to the editors-in-chief of various newspapers and say, we appreciate if you think of those.
We have leaked documents from left and right, from media editors, from CNN to BBC, where they instructed how to frame. It's called framing.
Framing, exactly.
Incidents in order to, shape public opinion. And most people do not realize how pervasive this has become now that we are all using AI algorithms to cater our own, own media bubble, where we get fed and regurgitated again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
The information that the algorithm thinks we want to see. Yeah. So this becomes really, really difficult. Yeah. Speaking of which,
somebody who decides what words are used to influence the minds of people. And the very important point, of course, you and I are hitting at here is there are always two wars. There's a war on the ground with military means, and there's a media. It's the war about the hearts and minds of people, invading our hearts and invading our minds. That type of invasion is worse sometimes than the military invasions.
Yeah, and this leads me to one thing I almost forgot. You have been banned from YouTube, so tell us everything about it. Talking about information war, so that fits perfectly.
Let me tell you what it is. I sat in China, in Shanghai, and tried to log into because I had something to upload, and then I suddenly find out that I cannot log into my YouTube account. And up comes a sign which says, we have closed down your channel, the TFF channel, not my personal one, but the one for our foundation, which had about 300-400 videos. And of course, I write to them and say, excuse me, what have we done wrong? They just say, they point to the message on the screen saying you have violated our community guidelines. And of course, I'd like to know, what does that mean? I'm not aware, as a peace researcher who argued for nonviolence and peaceful resolution of various conflicts, I'm not aware that I have violated anybody's guidelines or that any of my colleagues whose videos are there, such as Johan Galtung, who has never spoken about anything but nonviolence. And you don't get an answer. You send the same letter 3 or 4 times, you never get an answer. And then the only answer you get is next time you try to log in, it tells you the account or the channel is closed, and it says we have reviewed it again and it will not be brought up again. I can't log into the account to upload or to do anything. It's now a dead archive. The funny thing is that the channel is still there.
I didn't find it. I tried there.
No. It is there. I can tell you, it is there. It's not a problem. It is there. The long story short is, either this is a technical mistake somehow, but then I wonder why my face comes up and say your account your channel has been closed down, and we're not bringing it up again. But my hunch is that they did want to bring it down, but somehow have not done so. So everybody can still see the 400 videos or whatever it is we have there in different playlists. But I can't do anything. It's in the sense that it's dead now. And the funny thing is, the same was said about my photography channel, my personal photography channel, meaning probably what they do is they want to prevent Jan Oberg from doing anything on YouTube. But what is there is still there. It's a little bit enigmatic to me. But
no.
I have to say, the nasty thing is you don't get an answer to any question. Yeah. They are arrogant enough to say, we have decided to censor you and we're not going to discuss it with you.
Yeah. I interviewed Kenneth O'Keefe. He was the former US Marine who was on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla a couple of years back, where he where he disarmed 2 Israeli commandos with his bare hands while they shot from helicopters 10 people on this boat. I interviewed him. He has 60,000 subscribers on YouTube, and he has exactly the same. They blocked him out. He cannot access it, but all the videos are still there. So
That's very
apparently,
interesting. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. Thanks for that information. But
Yeah.
that's the situation. So when I say, I can't say that they've taken down our videos, because they have not taken down our videos, but they prevent me from doing anything. What I do now is that we move all the videos we have there over to Substack. Because it's not very important to have a channel on YouTube. The question is, which videos do you produce yourself, and which videos do you want to distribute that others are doing, which, I mean, for instance, I want to have all the videos that our associates, such as Biljana Vankovska or Johan Galtung or Glenn Deason and others, have produced. They will be on Substack in the future. Glenn Deason is a relatively new associate of the foundation.
Very good. Give him my greetings. I interviewed him. Yeah.
Okay, good. His video should be there too. That's what I mean. So we haven't produced a lot of materials. We've not been really into video production, but we do playlists with good people because we think it has an educational effect that people students can watch videos with peace researchers.
Yeah. Speaking of Glenn Deason, he wrote his PhD on the happenings on the so-called Maidan revolution in Kiev in 2014. Maybe you want to comment.
No, not on his work, because honestly,
on the situation.
I've not read his dissertation. But if you mean what happened at that time, it was a regime change.
It was a coup, a Western-led
coup d'etat, regime change, like Syria was. I mean,
a Western-led regime change.
You just find a kind of pretext. You pour in a lot of money. The same was done in Yugoslavia. I mean, come on, Serbia. They work by means of NGOs, as it's called, non-governmental organizations. The problem is that many non-governmental organizations have become near-governmental organizations. Some of us are totally free from this, but that's a different story. As I told you before, we don't receive money from anybody but people, ordinary citizens, big, old and young. Now, that was what was happening in 2014. There's no doubt. Let me tell you. No, I can take that after. But there's no doubt that was a regime change of the Obama regime, administration, whatever you want to call it. When you do that type of stuff, I think we can call them regimes. But on the other hand, I'm a staunch advocate of calling those types of things governments. But that is what Madame Nuland has been saying all the time. We paid $5 billion to NGOs to, influence. It's an influencer kind of thing. And the purpose was, of course, to get rid of Yanukovych, who was made to flee, and then getting Poroshenko, or the chocolate king, as he was called, or something like that, into becoming a president. And then you built it up, and you killed Russians, and you eradicated the Russian language. You did all these kinds of things because you wanted NATO to expand into Ukraine. And now you take Kissinger, you take Brzezinski, you take Oberg, you take Mearsheimer, you take anybody who knows a little bit about these things, say, maybe you can do Montenegro with 600,000 inhabitants in NATO. I mean, the Russians would probably not feel that very threatening, although it's a stupid thing to do. Same goes for Macedonia, etc. But Ukraine, don't ever do that. It means war. But NATO, was so full of hubris and self-justifications, etc., that they say, we're not letting anybody decide who should be a member, and we know that Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO. That is not true. I have gone through, because I wrote a book, 150 pages, it's online, everybody can read it freely. I went through all opinion polls made in Ukraine. They were made by the Department of Sociology at Kiev University with American survey experts helping. There is no opinion poll made up to the invasion that shows that more than between maximum 12 and 15% of the Ukrainian people, all of them, wanted NATO membership. It is a damn lie when Stoltenberg and everybody else says, oh, Ukraine wants this and that, and nobody should interfere with the choice of the Ukrainian people. They want to be in NATO. They never wanted to be in NATO. What they wanted, a far majority was, they wanted a military agreement with Russia. Probably, I don't know, I haven't seen the text, but they wanted a good relationship with Russia, and then a referendum about the future alliance or relations, so whether to the EU or not. More than 60% of the Ukrainian people wanted to have a referendum on these issues. Now, in comes Poroshenko, and in 2017 or 18, he declares in parliament, there is now, it's now put into the constitution of Ukraine that Ukraine shall join NATO. That came on top of Putin's speech at the Munich conference in 2007, where he said, what happened to all the promises you gave Gorbachev about not expanding? He did it in a very low-key, very factual, and perfectly okay intellectual manner, in my view. The answer he got was the year after, when at the NATO meeting, I'm forgetting where it was, Budapest or whatever, it doesn't matter, 2008, NATO decided, Bucharest, sorry, right, yeah. Thanks. Bucharest meeting decided that Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members, no matter what. Now, that kind of slapping people again and again in their face is something that the Westerners do not understand. They don't understand what it
means niet. That's what he said.
Well, you could have negotiated that. I have written about it. I said you can keep neutrality status. You can have good agreements with both parties, with both sides. You could turn Ukraine into a very interesting type of Switzerland with its history. You could move the United Nations Center from New York. The Americans don't deserve to have it there, and you could put it up in Kiev. You could have all kinds of, investments from East and West. You could have made Ukraine a fantastic place to live as a neutral state with, let's say, non-aggression agreements with both Russia and the Western world, etc. You could have made this a huge Switzerland. That would be my model. You could have done cantonization, where you have mixed minorities inside each other. There are enough models around the world. You could have done autonomy solutions. You could have done everything, but there was only one thing NATO wanted, that was to be fully inside and up to the border, under the skirts of Mother Russia. Now, that is so blatantly unintelligent and arrogant and insensitive that NATO deserves to fall apart because of this, the hugest blunder NATO has ever done. And that is not set to defend what Putin did. I am able to just say that invasion was wrong, but even more wrong was NATO's expansion. Now, if people cannot intellectually keep that, and then I'm a Putin lover, so be it. I don't even argue with people who think that I am. I don't have time. I'm too old to spend my time on this.
I think Trump indicated already a couple of times to disengage from NATO, and we both know if America goes out of the NATO, NATO will crumble. But then the question is, I think I heard you speak. I watched quite a number of interviews where you're speaking in preparation to this one. Yeah, I think you said something like this. We would have a multipolar world, which is anyway coming. Even the blind see now that.
Oh yes. Oh,
but I think also one of the consequences of having, I don't want to make an argument for unipolarity. Yeah, this is not what I want. But we see now that there will be a transition period where we will see multiple local and not so local wars, which will lead us to a multipolarity, because this doesn't, this is not being created overnight and peacefully. So many states will try to, reshape the new world in their image. Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons why Israel, for example, at this moment can go that far. Because
I couldn't hear that. Who can go that far?
Israel. Because
sorry, yes.
There is no more clear line, even within the US, especially now during this, cycle from Biden, Trump. That there is no more, how shall I say this, guiding hand from the US to Israel. I would even say, I'm not even sure how much influence any US president, be it Biden, Kamala, or Trump, would have on, let's say, Netanyahu government. I don't say Netanyahu. because he could be gone by tomorrow, but that doesn't mean things will change. So what we are seeing here is, a development that maybe not everybody has anticipated. And one last thing I would like to say, it sounds counterintuitive. I returned from Jordan 2-3 weeks ago. We had the opportunity to interview 4 top diplomats, one of being the former foreign minister, Dr. Marwan Mouasha. And they have real concern that Israel might not only push the Palestinians, most, if not all of them, into Jordan, but that Israel includes Jordan in their larger Israel plan.
The Greater
right?
Israel, they
The
do.
Greater Israel plan, from
what is
the
it,
river to the
20% of
sea.
Syria, apart from the
Exactly.
Golan, it's going on like madness.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is, this can only happen because the influence of America goes down, is dwindling. That's the reason. And we will probably, and I hope I'm wrong, we might see similar situations in other parts of the world. That's my fear.
Thomas has no doubt in my mind that if we have 192 or 93 member states of the United Nations.
193, yeah.
Yeah. If, a far majority of those, you saw it in the Cuba voting, there were 2 countries that was against lifting the sanctions. The whole rest of the world were for lifting the sanctions on Cuba. If you have those proportions, 2 states who are rogue states, illegal behavior, criminal behavior and all that, I think there's something wrong if we can't stop it.
True.
I can't say exactly what it is, because I'm not sitting here arguing for a huge military invasion of Israel, but I could have seen long ago sanctions, isolation, the idea of at least suspending Israel from the United Nations for an extended period until it behaves itself.
Like South Africa.
Whatever. But it's not happening. So I'm not sure that this is because the US is weak or strong. But what I'm sure of is that somebody is not strong enough, whether it's China or it's the Arab states or it's Africa or whatever, but somebody should be able in a multipolar democratic, somehow we all have influence, big or small, to stop what is going on. So you may say it's actually a proof that Israel and the US are quite strong, and they are strong militarily. And Israel does have nuclear weapons. So, there is something that would make me think of what is wrong with the international society. Because if you and I lived in a local society in which 2 people or 1 person could bully everybody else in the neighborhood and get away with it, and there's no police, how would we feel? So I think we are in a situation that raises some question marks about whether or not we should have a United Nations with a 100 times bigger budget, clear mandate, to be able to, according to the Charter of the UN, to intervene when things like this happened under the military leadership of the UN, not the US or NATO or somebody else. That is international law until we change it. But the UN has been marginalized completely, particularly by NATO countries and all their warfare and all this kind of thing. And be aware also that NATO is a criminal organization, and NATO is led by the US, in the sense that it violates its own treaty 24/7. The treaty is a piece of paper you and I think, could easily sign. It only says we're a group of members who want to support each other. If one is attacked, the rest is obliged to come and help that one who is attacked within our group of members. Now, what is NATO today? It's an interventionist organization that has decided not to intervene in the Israeli case to support international law, but supports Israel's gross violation and genocide on poor people and civilians. So, long story short, we're living in a global society in which law does not apply anymore. And I don't know what to do with that. I think we should do some interviews with good lawyers like Richard Falk or somebody, who is who knows international law and can put their fingers on and say, where is it we fail? Is it only politically, or is there something in international law that prevents us from stopping the criminals who are so clearly a minority of the world? That is really mind-boggling to me. And I think the Americans could have stopped it long ago. If they had put down the foot and said, now this fire no longer, you stop this, you will have no more ammunition, you will have no more political support, we withdraw everything from you, we will trade no more with you, we will do nothing, we will isolate you completely, we will argue in the UN that you will be isolated or suspended from the UN for the first time. You know, things might have changed. Even Netanyahu will have to think at some time, at some point, how far he wants to go and what kinds of stuff. He knows that the US will not touch him. That is a problem.
And we could go on this line of argumentation in regards to Israel and why Israel has this kind of, blank check to do what it wants.
Yeah, but that has to do with history and your country.
This has to do partially, yeah. With but they're very.
I don't know any other group that would get away with this, but a Jewish state.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about Jews because they're good people like anybody else. But I'm saying it calls itself a Jewish state, and that blames all Jews in the world for what kind of makes them co-guilty, which is very unfair, but makes them co-guilty of what the Zionist state does. But Netanyahu has deliberately mixed Zionism with Jewishness.
And there he just received a blow from a court in the UK because Professor David Miller was fired from the university in Bristol. He sued them and he won with the statement of the UK court that you cannot conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. The court case was in last February. I interviewed Professor David Miller. So this could be a precedence, because of course anyone conflating those two has the strategy to eradicate any legitimate critic on the state of Israel.
That is the point.
Yeah, that's the point.
That's the point. We're all anti-Semitism if we say a critical word about Israel's Zionist expansion is the greater Israel-Palestine and genocide. I mean, this is again, I mean, it's not reality. You know, I feel compared with, what I saw 20, 30, 40 years ago, we are now living in a narrative, and decision makers are making decisions within a narrative. They have no touch with reality anymore. Yeah. The Western world needs a reality check because, you take the Danish prime minister, it's just on my mind because it just happened. She walks in on the 7th of October into the synagogue in Copenhagen in support of Israel. And what happened on the 7th of October? And before she walks in, she says to a journalist that this is terrible. And, of course, children are being killed and all that. But Hamas would invade Denmark also if they could get away with it. That's a moment when I say that must be a narrative. It cannot be reality. There's no evidence. There's nothing you could argue that Hamas would invade Denmark if we don't stop them in Gaza. So, I'm just saying we are so far out in the Western world that we live by fantasy. I have stopped long ago thinking that you can understand international politics by means of political science or international relations theories and concepts, things like Mearsheimer is talking about and all that. To understand the Western world today, you need to talk about psychology, psychiatry, theology, what do you call that? The end views. People are talking about nuclear weapons as if it was like anybody else, any other weapon, etc. We're totally out of an intellectual, fact-based, analytical approach to international politics. It goes completely by emotionalism. Oh, Hamas is going to invade Denmark, right? So we can do whatever we want.
This is no accident. This is on purpose.
Well, I'm not sure about that. This is something, the more you tell lies, the more you get into it's called groupthink.
Let me give you one example, if I may.
And that groupthink is a terribly dangerous piece of psychology. You have a little group of people who over time become convinced that they cannot make mistakes, that they are right. Everything that says outside their box that they are not right is ignored and repelled. And then they make a final decision, which is totally disastrous. That could be nuclear war or big war.
But it is manufactured. It is manufactured. And I would like to give you one example, and then I really would like to switch to Sweden, Olof Palme and the submarines, if we still have time. Okay?
Okay.
But one example, yeah. As a behavior analyst, I see the framing and the manipulation that's going on in all media. And if you want to get better information, you have to actually look outside of the media bubble within NATO. Yeah, but again, one concrete example: the 40 babies that Hamas was supposed to have killed. The story is totally debunked.
Yeah,
it was propagated by I don't know how many people, inclusive President Biden. The White House even had to pedal back later. Yeah. Now, when I heard this story of the 40 babies, I immediately thought back. Where did we hear this story before? Oh yeah, Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. There was this lady testifying with, also this young girl actually, testifying with crocodile ears in front of the Congress.
The incubator story.
The incubator story, yeah, exactly. The Iraqis went in the hospital, took the baby out, smashed them on the ground, etc., etc. Now, what turns out, of course, we all know that was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, exactly, who testified this. What's less known is the fact that this story, this girl didn't suck it out of her thumb. There was a prominent American PR company who designed the whole concept. So exactly. That's why I'm saying
Helen Knowlton or something like that.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying this.
I'm not sure. I think it was. There was two of those. There was a Finn something, and there was Helen Knowlton. But they constructed the whole thing in a stage set in New York.
That's why I'm saying this is manufactured. There are strong and powerful interest groups, and I don't want to go into kind of conspiracy, but we know this is manufactured.
Yes, no, that is very true. I thought you meant that it was manufactured, that you do emotionalist decision making, because you can still, even if you have these things and you know them as a top decision maker, a minister or prime minister or something like that, you can still make intelligent decisions around them or something like that. I believe that people now in the Western world are so far out and so subconsciously aware of the fact that our power is declining that you're desperately clinging to whatever you can cling to. And that is emotionalist. That is within the narrative that we are the good guys. We have done nothing wrong. What Putin did was unprovoked, etc. They believe in that. I don't think it's just propaganda to make you and me believe it. I believe that decision makers themselves over time come to believe in their own lies, if you will. Of course. Now, I'm giving that a very rough name, but okay.
Yeah, and not all decision makers are in. They fall victim to the same propaganda that, whoever sits there on top, and manufacturing, this is the perfect, also manufacturing, to quote Noam Chomsky, who I also interviewed, manufacturing consent, which is a perfect gateway into Sweden and the U-boat scare, So Sweden recently has joined NATO. I could not believe it when I heard it. People do not realize this is not the first attempt to to scare Sweden to join NATO. And this is where the U-boat scare comes in. So please elaborate.
Well, first of all, Sweden joined with a very one-sided debate, whole evening discussions, and one person would be against NATO membership in the Peace and Arbitration Society, and the rest, politicians, other experts, etc., would be pro. So, that was it. And we had 48%, 47 or 48% who were in favor of membership when the application was sent by the Social Democratic female state and prime minister at the time, Magdalena Andersson. So I was pretty surprised, not only how stupid that decision is for Sweden, how ill-considered it was, how it was taken without debate. But I was more surprised by the fact that you could switch media and left to right in favor of it. The new thing you and I have not seen before is that the left and right are all militarists. You have the far left party in Denmark arguing, arm Ukraine as much as we can. We must win over Russia. I knew what the left-wingers and social democrats were like in the 80s and 90s. They didn't, 70s, they didn't think that way. So that's one thing. But mind you, also for your viewers, after that, Sweden made a secret agreement a bilateral agreement with the US about establishing 17 US bases on Swedish soil. That was on top of the NATO membership.
And that means nuclear weapons on Swedish soil.
That's what some of us think, because the paper written about this does not mention nuclear weapons. And the argument is, well, they know that we don't want them, so they will not take it with them. And therefore, we will also not ask the Americans whether they take in nuclear weapons, because, the Americans have this standard formulation: we neither confirm nor deny. Whereas if you take the Danish agreement, the Norwegian agreement about the same nuclear weapons are mentioned that we don't want them. So within less than a year, the United States has gotten about 40 military bases, 17 in Sweden, 15 in Finland, 3 or 4 in Denmark, and some, I'm not quite sure about the figure in Norway, but in no time, you have the Americans all over the place, and each base is under American jurisdiction. Now, this is worse than the NATO membership. Also because the Swedish defense minister went over to Washington in December last year and signed the agreement. And then it passed the Swedish parliament in June this year. So you sign a binding agreement for 10 years about selling out your country and your sovereignty to the American 17 bases, and you do it before you have a decision about it in Parliament. Now, I want your readers, your viewers, to know that this is how the so-called democracy in the West works now. It's the opposite. You make the decision when you have had a public discussion. You don't make a decision first and then get it through the Parliament afterwards. And then you have all the media who are for it. I could tell you a long story about how the Swedish television has treated me, which says everything about the manipulation. But I guess we don't have time for that. The submarines, yes, there was a submarine U-137, which went on top of the sand outside Karlskrona. Now, I am not an expert on that, but I have a very good friend who is a peace researcher and who studied this more than anybody else, and his name is Ola Thunander.
I'm in contact with him.
Okay. And then you know also that from his studies, which I think are very solid and make sense politically also, this was not a Russian submarine in the sense that it was a, what do you call that? It was a piece of what do you call a psyop, a psychological operation to make the Swedish people believe that they could not defend themselves against a Russian threat. So you had that submarine put not. If you looked at the traces on the sand, the captain had obviously pushed it up as high as possible to be seen. And that was a few weeks after Caspar Weinberger, the then Secretary of Defense of the US, for the first time had visited Sweden. And in the same morning as they found this in the morning, this submarine, there were 2 American military attaches who knocked on the door at the base and said, we'd like to speak with the guy who's running this place. Long story short, as Ola Thunander points out, this was a communicator operation. It was not the captain who was important. It was a man who was installed there, I'm forgetting his name, but he has disappeared since then. You can't find him anywhere on the net or something like that. He was a Russian, obviously, but a man who communicated, and he was the only one who was not interviewed by Swedish authorities. Now, the consequences of this psyop, this psychological operation against the Swedish people, of course, was to prepare it for a change. At that time, Olof Palme was alive, but then Olof Palme was killed, and we still don't know who did it. You can have different hypotheses. I think he was killed for political reasons because he was a visionary, he was a man of peace, he was also an arms seller, don't forget that. He was very smart. He could sell arms for Sweden and Bofors in the morning and speak peace and disarmament in the afternoon. I knew him once and had a very long conversation with him. A splendid intellectual. I was very angry because it was when I was a relatively young researcher, and I sat in the Danish government's commission for disarmament and security as an expert. And then Olof Palme had been invited by the Social Democratic Prime Minister of Denmark, Anker Jørgensen, whom I also knew. And then we had a lunch. And Anker Jørgensen says to Olof Palme, "Oh, Olof, you should sit next to Jan. He's a student at Lund University, Sweden. So you can talk about peace and all that, you know." And Palme said, I said to myself, wow, now I have a chance to interview the Prime Minister, a man whom I always looked up to as an intellectual and a very good speaker also, a personality. And I said, wow, now I have a chance to interview him. But the problem was that all through the lunch, he hardly ate anything. He interviewed me, so I didn't get a word. You know, he wanted to know everything about how a young peace researcher thought about the world. And that was, of course, a good intellectual's job. But I remember I was quite disappointed that I didn't get any of the questions I would have liked to ask him. So, but long story short, he was killed. And whether you can say that there is a causal relation, that I don't know, because I would be lying to you if I said I knew who killed Olof Palme, but I think he was killed for political reasons. But after his death, Sweden turned 180 degrees. He was hated by many people also in Sweden and the security services, etc., because he was not pro-American enough. He was pro-American, but not enough.
Unaligned.
And he had this perverse idea that you talk with other people. He risked his life and went to mediate in the Iraq war. He was deeply committed, and I know from what he's been saying, his visit to Hiroshima made him a staunch believer in nuclear abolition. And so he had, and this commission, they headed also, there's no doubt about Olof Palme's seriousness, deep commitment to peace. But he also had the idea that as long as we are not there, Sweden must be able to defend itself as a neutral state because we are not being helped by anybody. So, I mean, there was a logic to it. But at the same time, I would have hoped that he would not have had this idea of Swedish arms exports and strong Swedish defense and all that. But that's my limitations, if you will. But the problem is that Sweden, that people think still exists, disappeared 20, 30 years ago. And I know this because I had quite a lot of things to do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And when I was the head of the department at Lund, my colleagues and I wrote tons of papers, even books for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They paid us for doing that because they wanted to know everything about what does deterrence mean and what does this mean and what does that mean. And you wrote your stuff, and then you were invited up and you sat a whole day, and these speechwriters and leaders of the ministry had to, note in all your papers and page after page. What do you mean by that? And how does that relate to what you say 5 pages earlier, etc.? There was an intellectualism. There was a knowledge that if you are neutral, you have to be stand on a very solid intellectual knowledge base. So you know where to put the country in times of crisis and things like that. Today, probably the same money is spent on public relations and promoting social media, whatever. There's no substance anymore anywhere. And of course, that's very simple. They take orders from Washington now. Why would you have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? It's actually not necessary. I mean, I'm joking a little bit, but you see what I'm saying. If you get basically your foreign policy, which is the case now, is a total following of Washington, and you take orders one way or another, why would you have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? You don't need it. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is State Department. So, now you have Swedish military people, top level flight guys who say Swedish defense begins at the border of NATO. And we're not going to have any individual policy about anything. And that is the beauty of Sweden before. It did have other policies. It thought for itself. It was an independent sovereign state. It is no longer the case. That's very sad.
You could say a similar thing about the Netherlands, where I'm living, seeing that Mark Rutte, the former PM, is now NATO Secretary General. Now, what does that mean? This is a reward for services rendered. And services rendered to whom? Who decides who becomes NATO General Secretary? Well, the US.
Like Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the Danish, exactly. Who participated for 4 years in the occupation of Iraq, as if Denmark had anything to do in Iraq. But he was very close to the Bush family also personally, bringing children over and all that, and then rewarded afterwards. And then he's one of the, as I call them, non-convicted war criminals, because he was also masterminding the destruction of Libya. And Denmark and Norway were among the heaviest bomber countries in Libya. Now, as I said, international law doesn't play any role anymore for those guys. For those guys, for you and me, it does, but for those guys, they couldn't care less.
Jan, you have been very generous with your time, which I really appreciate. Before we conclude this interview, is there any specific topic that's close to your heart that we haven't scratched on?
Yes, peace. Because we have a tendency, and that's because we're living in crisis and probably because we're human beings, everybody's looking into all the problems we have. We do diagnosis and we do prognosis and we say, oh my God, there's going to be a big war and things like that. A peace researcher is somebody, and I'm here quoting Johan Galtung, who does diagnosis, prognosis, and comes up with ideas of treatment. So I think that the role of peace research, and of course, in principle, all other research, is to come up with solutions. When you know things, and when you have seen things will go madly wrong if we don't do something, it's your damn duty not to leave this to politicians, but to come up with some peace plan or whatever it is. And I have always thought that it was important to be constructive, to leave people with positive energy and say, yes, there are things that can be done. Why didn't I think of that? And here I always quote George Bernard Shaw, who allegedly said something, I haven't checked it, but allegedly said something like, most people look at the world as it is and ask why. What we should do is to look at the world as it could be and ask why not. And that's what the peace researcher does at the end of the cycle of diagnosis, prognosis, knowing something, looking into the future with your knowledge, and then saying, my goodness, it's going wrong. We must do something new. And so I would like to see a global security system in which we put peace first and then security. Because things like Gaza and Ukraine and, lots of other wars and the global war on terror proves one thing. If you're not an idiot, you can see it. That security first by military means will never lead to peace. Because it's built on offensive deterrence. The moment I say to you, Thomas, I will deter you from doing this and that, I have already seen you as an enemy. Now, if I want to use deterrence, I distinguish between offensive deterrence. That means I can kill you 5,000 kilometers away if you do something I don't like or if you don't do what I tell you to do. Whereas defensive deterrence means you can come to my place, I will not touch you, but if you come to my place, I will give you help. So the symbol of defensive deterrence, or defensive defense, is the Chinese wall. It doesn't hurt anybody, but it's probably quite difficult. It was probably difficult to get over. So what I think is we ought to have a global system in which we first find out what peace is and go for it, and then we secure it with a combi defense. For those people who think we should have the military, they should be completely defensive, short distance, limited destructive capacity, high mobility. And for those of us who think we should not have military, we could combine that distinguished from each other in space and time with non-violent conflict resolution, with early warning, with conflict studies, with peace experts in our ministries, maybe with peace ministries, and we would have civil defense, civil resistance, and we will have self-reliant societies who can withstand crisis, at least for a period. Today, we're so intertwined with everybody else that we cannot, we are victims. Anybody who wants to make sanctions against us will hurt us, which is why the United States are making, has this sanctionitis, as I call it, that disease, sanctions, I think about 100,000 sanctions against everybody in the world. And so if we then also strengthen the United Nations, reform it, and we become less nationalistic, but accept there is something higher for humanity, then we could practice common security. And the way to disarmament is not to get rid of some weapons. It is to create a better defense that everybody wants to participate in and is making all safe. And then we can get rid of the nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons because we've been told that that gives us security. Create another defense, create another security and peace thinking, and then you will see that they give us insecurity. And everything NATO stands for is outdated now. I've argued, I'm probably one of the very few who's argued why it must be abolished. There's 30 reasons for that in a publication you can find on transnational.live. We must begin to think differently. And the peace movement must stop being just anti-war, anti-weapons, and anti-militarism and become pro-peace. Come up and say, if you had all the powers in the world, what would you do? That is the intellectual challenge. You don't find it in research anymore. Not even at CIPRI in Stockholm, they don't do peace research anymore. They clearly say they don't. You don't find it in the media. Nobody wants to hear about alternatives. I know it's damn dangerous. When I talk about the people call me up from some media and they say, well, what are your views on this and that? I say, these are my critical views and these are what I think we should do. They don't call back and make the appointment as they said they would, because we don't want somebody to say there could be done differently. You are supposed to think there's only one way to do things, and that's NATO's. So I'm a dangerous person because I'm smart enough to say it can be done in 10 other ways than NATO. And that's what people don't like. Politicians, decision makers are not afraid of criticism. They are afraid of people who have better ideas. And they're afraid if somebody should say, wow, of course we could do it that way. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't we have a discussion about that? That's when it becomes dangerous. So I'm a staunch believer in positive thinking. And I don't think we will mobilize the world for good thinking, a good future, if they cannot imagine it. You cannot change the world by just being against something. You have to change the world by being for something. And that's a long story. So that's why I said I would like to say something about peace.
Last question. If people want to get, and I think you answered it already, but just to verify, if people want to get in touch with you, that's transnational.live. This is the best way to reach out to you?
Yes, that's our homepage, or you can reach us on Substack also, which is called TFF, Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. That's TFF. So it's just the right to Oberg transnational.org. That's .org, but the homepage is transnational.live. But I mean, I'm all over the place, even with telephone numbers and mails and Twitter and WeChat and LinkedIn and God knows what. There's no problem in contacting us.
Good.
Like you
Jan,
did.
like I did, yeah. Jan Oberg, it was a real pleasure talking to you. You're very
Thank you
lively.
so much.
You're a very lively speaker.
Thank you.
You are knowledgeable about a very broad spectrum of issues based on your background, of course. Yeah. Let's not forget you are an academic. You actually have studied that stuff. You know what you're talking about. Okay.
I hope so.
Jan,
50
my
years
pleasure.
should give you something.
My pleasure. You will hear from me again.
My pleasure too, Thomas. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. It really makes a difference. And as said before, if you really want to keep up with my work, make sure you subscribe on Substack. In my Substack newsletters, I dig even deeper. I break down tricky ideas, show you practical analytical techniques, and explain how you can use them in your life. It's free, the link is right below, and I would love for you to join the conversation. Let me know how it's changing the way you look at the world and its people. And as always, thanks for your support and see you next time.